the story that I'm going to tell you today is indeed a bittersweet symphony. You'll remember that on Thursday of last week I talked to you about Britain's experience of the Second World War and the degree to which the war radicalized the British people and provided the foundations for the emergence of a new type of political and social contract that became known as social democracy. And today I'm going to talk to you about how that system was developed by the Labour government that was elected after the end of the war in 1945 by a landslide majority. So I'll talk to you about this, and then I'm going to talk to you about the Festival of Britain, which is an event that they put on in 1951 to mark the centenary year of the Great Exhibition of 1851 that we began the course with. So the Festival of Britain in 1951 is going to show you what a fundamentally different vision of Britain's role in the world and of Britain itself as compared to the celebration of liberal free trade in 1851. Now, you'll remember on Thursday that I made the point that the Second World War was neither as destructive for Britons as the First World War, in that fewer Britons died, or as culturally traumatic as the First World War. But, I suggested, it was politically more transformative. The idea that the First World War had built a new type of social contract that led to the advent of the universal franchise, where all men had the vote and some women, and that the veterans were going to return for homes fit for heroes, didn't last very long. Most of those veterans spent most of the 1920s and the 30s unemployed and malnourished. That was not going to be the case after the Second World War. And so one of the key features of the period after 1945 was what it was that the new Labour government was trying to construct. Was it trying to construct a brand new, shiny socialist future? Okay, and you've all read, we'll talk about Let Us Face the Future, the Labour Party manifesto of 1945 a little later. Was it trying to build this brand new socialist New Jerusalem? Or was it trying to simply say, we will not have a return to the dark days of the 1920s and the 1930s? And I'm going to suggest to you today that the Labour Party is in some ways caught between both of these ideas. It's caught between, on the one hand, being haunted by the memory of the unemployment and depression of the 1930s, probably best characterized by the Jarrow marches. Remember the hunger march down from Jarrow, where 80% of men were unemployed in 1936. And the attempt to envision a new type of socialist future. And as I also said to you on Thursday, really the great puzzle that we have to answer, and that I'm going to begin by trying to address in this lecture, is why is it that this new social and political system that emerges after 1945 lasted for such a brief amount of time? And let me remind you what the central characteristics of that system was, okay? Because it's now a world that seems very alien to people who've grown up in California in the 1990s and the 21st century. This is a world structured by a division of public and private ownership. That is to say that the state took control, took ownership of certain leading manufacturing and industrial sectors. Okay? We were the state command of the economy. It was also predicated around the institutions of the welfare state. And the ones that I'll talk to you about today are a nationalized health system that makes Obamacare look like a drop in the ocean, universal free education, housing and the construction of community, and full employment. Now, this seems like a type of nirvana to many people, including myself. Okay, and so we need to be able to understand what the strengths and weaknesses of this system was. Why it was, in short, that this system that seemed to promise so much, and indeed radically did improve the standards of living for several generations of Britons, why this system was so vulnerable to critique in the 1970s with the rise of neoliberalism, which in Britain took the form of a certain Mrs. Margaret Thatcher. Why, in short, do we live in the type of world that we live in today, structured by a return to market principles and market organizations, and not one that was carved out both in the US and in the UK in the 1940s? Now, there's a fabulous book by a colleague of mine in the anthropology department, Alexei Yurchak, called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. Okay? And it's an account of the collapse of the Soviet Union and how suddenly and dramatically that collapse occurred. I'm going to suggest to you that that isn't a good title for a book explaining the collapse of social democracy. That in fact, it was a rather long, slow process of decay and internal collapse. I'm also going to suggest to you today that the social democratic revolution in Britain in the 40s and 50s was not a democratic one. It was a technocratic revolution. That is to say, it was driven primarily by technocratic forms of knowledge and expertise rather than by a democratic mobilization of the people. And in that sense, you can think of it as not a million miles away from the world of Bentham and the reform of the social domain in the 19th century, where you remember from the 1830s onwards, you have a whole new series of people saying they had control and knowledge of the social domain and that they could manipulate it to work more effectively, to solve the so-called social problem. In many ways, I'm going to suggest to you that even though the vision of society was far more inclusive in the 1940s and 50s, much more radical in its orientation, it remained one animated and created by an elite group of experts, not by the democratic, not by democratic processes. Which is not to say that these people didn't have a democratic mandate. Remember, the Labour Party was elected with a huge majority, electoral majority. But I'm trying to make the point that people weren't mobilized en masse in the creation of this type of world. So the last thing I'm going to do today is try and explain to you why this world lasted for such a brief length of time. Part of it is the nature of this technocratic rather than democratic revolution. Okay, it's no coincidence that when Reagan and Thatcher emerged in the 70s and 80s, one of their big targets of critique are the experts of welfare systems and of the sort of social democratic world. But I'm also going to suggest to you today that social democracy didn't last because of partly because of the conditions that it emerged in, and partly by it was flawed by its own internal contradictions. Okay, so first, the conditions in which it emerged. Basically, I'm going to suggest to you that Britain was bankrupt by the experience of fighting 2 world wars, and that financially there were not the resources available to materially construct the world that social democratic workers wanted to build. And that therefore there were real compromises in terms of social infrastructure when it came to the constructions of schools and hospitals and housing. This was what you might call social democracy by gaslight. That is to say, many of the material infrastructures that social democracy was built on had been built in the Victorian period, okay? Not in the 1940s and 1950s. The other key element of its demise, I'm going to suggest, was its internal contradictions. Social democracy remained haunted by the ideological entrails of liberalism, as we saw with the Beveridge Report of 1942, where he invoked his system of universal social insurance to get rid of ignorance, squalor, idleness, disease, and want. That very Victorian liberal vocabulary. And as a consequence of that, many people remain marginalized in the new social democratic system. The universal ambitions of social democracy were never achieved. There were always people left out, primarily, I'm going to suggest, in terms of class and in gender. And after that very long-winded introduction, you'll be glad to know that we're moving on. So the first section then on the key elements of building this new social democracy. And I've just realized that health should be in there somewhere. I think probably between family and education. So, if the Beveridge Report of 1942 talked in this very Victorian vocabulary, how far did the Labour Manifesto of 1945 let us face the future, that optimistically forward-looking titled manifesto? How did it manage to translate ignorance into education, want into poverty, idleness into employment, squalor into housing? This is the task that people who supported the Labour Party had in the second half of the 1940s and 1950s, of turning that Victorian framework into something that was more positive in terms of its vocabulary and frame of reference. So, how many of you have, no, I'm not actually going to, far too embarrassing a question to ask, because I know you've all had a fun time at Halloween. How many of you went trick-or-treating? Okay, informal poll here. What is the age that most of you stopped trick-or-treating? Did you stop in high school? Raise your hand. Anyone stop in middle school? Yeah, I'm actually, I have to say, I find trick-or-treating for high schoolers a little... Anyone, let me just go for a third category. Did anyone stop at college? They're now too embarrassed to raise their hand. But you know there's someone out there who probably went trick-or-treating last night. Anyway, given that none of you were out trick-or-treating last night, allegedly, then that means that you'll all have had plenty of time to read Let Us Face the Future. How do you think Let Us Face the Future presents itself? Does it present itself as a socialist program for the reconstruction of Britain? Yes.